Oops, hang on.
Mine says recording.
I don't see anything.
All right.
Oh, I see recording up there. Yes.
All right,
Yes.
here we go. Just a couple of announcements before we get to the tonight's speaker. First, we'll be back here on Zoom on Wednesday night, April 21st, to hear from one of our favorite Northeast Ohio naturalists, Judy Semrock. Judy will be presenting Hiding in Plain Sight, Amazing Patterns of Camouflage and Mimicry in Nature. You may remember Judy from a very informative program she did a couple of years ago for us on dragonflies and damselflies. She's part of the team at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History who have put together a number of excellent publications, including their guide to goldenrod species of Northeast Ohio and the museum's authoritative book on dragonflies and damselflies. In April, Judy will share images and discuss examples of how animals and plants mislead and deceive in order to survive in nature. So mark your calendars for the evening of April 21st and watch the Photo Society website and Facebook page so you can be sure to get the Zoom link for that presentation. We will be holding our next photo walk from April 17th through May 3rd at a location that Jerry Jelinek will pick as he keeps tab on how the spring weather develops in the next few weeks. Again, watch for an email announcement if you're a member of the Photo Society and for a posting on our Facebook page for complete information about the location and details of the image critique session. Now it's time to turn our attention to tonight's program. While I would be very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to defer to Jim Retzel. He could probably do a better introduction than I could on most any given evening, but tonight even more so. Jim has known Mari for a number of years, and he's actually the one who originally helped us get Mari on the schedule for June of last year. We end up scrubbing that presentation because of the pandemic, but I'm very happy we were able to reschedule it for tonight. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Jim to introduce our speaker. Jim?
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Two things I do want to make sure if you can get to Judy Semrock's presentation or watch it. She's wonderful. She's an especially gifted naturalist in terms of her science, but she's also a bit of a poet, and the marriage of those two things is pretty special. I've always enjoyed time I've spent with her in various things, and like Judy, that's what Mari Reed is to me. She's more of a poet with a camera than the legions of bird photographers who are barrel-chested and somewhat obtuse. And Mari and I have been with all of them on many occasions because you do have to share these wonderful fields. We met in 1997 on a photo excursion with a dear friend that we both loved, Tom Vizo. Tom is no longer with us, and we both miss him. Anytime we get to certain places, we think of him immediately. Anyway, the three of us were in a car. We were in Winnie, Texas. If you've never heard of Winnie, Texas, don't be surprised. It's in Texas, but it's right on the Louisiana border. And we got iced into the motel. Our motel had electricity and lighting, but most didn't. And there was one restaurant, a Waffle House, my least favorite restaurant in the world, that allowed smoking at that time. And I felt it was a little bit of a personal hell. But anyway, so they let us go out one day. The roads were closed. So I was saying they let us go out. We found out that we were allowed to go out, and we went out. And Winnie, Texas is near a national wildlife refuge called Anahuac. And Anahuac was at one time a great facility. It has been hit twice by hurricanes, and much of it no longer even exists. But at that time, it was a great place to be, but not on that day. But we kind of walked our way down there. It's south of where we were staying, hence the reference to walking our way down. And we're going through the refuge, and there's nothing there. There's not a bird. And I remember we saw two birds. One was a shrike, which I think we all got a few shots of. But what I remember is, I believe, and Mari and I couldn't, neither one of us could really remember. It was a raptor, and I'm pretty sure it was a kestrel. And her comment was, I don't think I can bring any dignity to that bird that it deserves. Now, that might sound like hyperbole to a lot of people, but if you're a birder and you love birds and you just happen to take pictures of them, that's exactly what it's supposed to be. That you know the bird, you know its nuances, you know its beauty, you know when it looks wonderful and when it doesn't, when the light and everything aligns for you to get this great image. And that's the soul of a naturalist lives on the other side of that camera. And the more that does, the better the work will be. And I've always admired Mari's, especially her portraits. We actually have some similarities in that we kind of like portraits. Now we're moving to action, but we're getting a little old for that, but we're doing our best to catch up with it. But anyway, and it is a pleasure to have known her all these years. We love running into each other. I think the last time we saw each other was in Bosque Apache a few years ago. Again, just by coincidence, you know, hi, hey, how you doing? And then I think we met for a meal or two. But anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Mari. She's, again, a dear friend and an amazing photographer and a great author. Sorry, I didn't mention your book. Mari will mention your book, but anyway, here you go.
Okay,
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. I'll go there, share here and there. Okay, so I hope everybody can see a couple of puffins. And I hope you can all hear me okay. So first of all, hello everybody, and thanks so much for inviting me this evening. And thank you, Jim, for that interesting and amusing and heartfelt introduction. So I bet we can all agree that it's been a long winter. I understand you've got some nice warm weather right now, but it's still pretty wintry where I am. And I think we're all craving some color to cheer up those drab winter landscape, you know, some greenery, some flowers, and of course, some beautiful birds. The colorful orioles like the Baltimore oriole, the tanagers, the warblers like the northern parula that I captured at Maggie Marsh a couple of springs ago when we could all go and travel, and the indigo bunting. All these colorful songbirds that are inherently photogenic simply by being bright and beautiful. And of course, I love to photograph them too, but I want my photos to show something more than the bird's appearance, to go beyond portraits and reveal its spirit. So how do you do that? How do you create images that portray the essence of a bird? Well, for certain birds, especially those with forward-facing eyes, like the raptors and owls, like the snowy owl, we can get a hint of that spirit with just a stare. Of course, we're just interpreting now, we're interpreting their facial expressions. So to us, owls look wise, and eagles and falcons look fierce, and so on. But that's not true for all species, because most birds simply don't possess the gravitas of a raptor, such as an Adelie penguin doesn't cut it when it comes to gravitas. They can't do much about that, of course, because birds can't change their facial expressions. So instead, to me, the secret to that avian spirit lies in the cool things that birds do. So capturing that spirit means photographing behavior, showing us how a bird lives its life, like a black skimmer skimming through the water with its amazing bill, scything through that water to capture fish. And it's an activity that relies on what we can really think of as the pinnacle of avian spirit, flight. So my goal is to capture these fleeting moments in birds' lives that reveal what it's like to be that bird, whether it's tender moments, such as between an American oyster catcher and its young, or tense moments between territorial rivals. And my plan for tonight is first to give you a bit of background about how I got into bird photography in the first place. And then we'll talk a little bit about equipment and field strategy. And then we'll take a look at some specific behaviors, including birds in flight. And I'll share some of the factors that went into capturing the photos of them. And my hope is that you'll take away some useful tips. And finally, as we were mentioning earlier, there'll be a Q&A session at the end, and Dave's going to curate and moderate that. So it all started long ago, not quite in the age of dinosaurs, but almost, definitely in the days of film. So I've been a bird watcher ever since I was a little kid in England in the 1950s. And that's where the accent comes from. But my photography, though, began in the mid-1980s in Kenya, in East Africa, where I joined my biologist husband on a research team, a field research team, studying white-fronted bee-eaters, which is what these little birds on the left are. And my job was to watch them closely through a spotting scope, as I'm doing on the right, collecting data on their social interactions. And that training opened up the world of bird behavior to me. And it also honed my observation skills and helped me develop good powers of concentration and persistence. And these are skills that were going to be really important to me in my future career as a bird photographer. So this was a very formative time in my life. We're talking about the mid-80s here. And we were living in Lake Nakuru National Park, surrounded by wildlife. So it was a no-brainer that eventually I'd pick up a camera, and then I was hooked. Here I am standing on the top of a vehicle, photographing a red-billed hornbill nest. And then in the 1990s, my husband's research took us to Panama. But by then I was pursuing my own photography projects. Specifically, I was capturing the bizarre courtship displays of tiny forest birds called manakins. This is a displaying golden collared manakin who displays by leaping around a little arena on the forest floor, making loud snapping noises with his wings. And that work involved spending long periods of time in blinds. In one case, up on a tower to be up at eye level, to capture a red-capped manakin displaying up in the trees. But you don't need to visit exotic places to photograph bird behavior. You can do it anywhere there are birds, of course, including in your own backyard. And in fact, it was a photo of one of our most common birds that first put me in the public eye. It was a black-capped chickadee drinking from a melting icicle that formed when a branch broke in the tree where my bird feeder was hanging, right outside my living room window near Ithaca, New York. Actually, that icicle is actually frozen tree sap, so I guess that makes it a sapsicle. So the story behind this, I saw the bird do it once and I was really excited to see it. And then I optimistically sat for an entire weekend with my lens focused on the tip of that icicle, hoping for a repeat. I got one frame, but it became a best-selling image, including appearing in Ranger Rick and Living Bird and various other places. And of course, today the camera settings sound laughable. Kodachrome 64 film, ISO 64, can you imagine? 125th of a second, manual focus lens. But this was 1989. Fast forward 30 plus years. And of course, the technological advances in cameras and lenses and processing software and so on between then and now have been nothing short of astonishing. First of all came the digital cameras, letting us ratchet up that ISO to get fast shutter speeds. So a 2000th of a second here for this cinnamon teal taking flight. Get fast frame rates, an incredible autofocus. And now we're in the midst of yet another revolution, mirrorless cameras, lighter in weight and more compact than the DSLRs are. And so in August 2019, after decades as a Canon shooter, I switched to a Sony mirrorless system. And there were several reasons for the switch, but one big one was simply not wanting to carry heavy gear around anymore. I'm just getting too old for that. And here's the before. This was 2014, I think, when I had the stamina and the motivation to carry around two entire systems. One Canon body with a 500mm f4 on it on a tripod, and a second body with a 100 to 400mm so I could hand hold for birds in flight. So most of the shots that you're going to see tonight were taken with one or other of these two Canon lenses. Compare that to what my gear looks like today. Sony A9 mirrorless body is my main bird camera, and a 200 to 600 millimeter zoom lens, a much more compact system. And I have the versatility and the portability of a zoom whose focal length range covers the entire range of those previous 2 Canon telephotos. So if you're thinking about upgrading your equipment, I'd strongly urge you to go the mirrorless route. Sony, of course, led the trend at first, but now Canon, Nikon, and other manufacturers have great mirrorless models too. And this new generation of cameras is not only more compact, but they have amazing autofocus systems and improved ability to handle high ISO noise. Really a great advance. And there's also a new generation of lightweight telephoto lenses too, adding to that portability. So we can all now quickly get into place without being encumbered by a tripod if we need be. And I certainly needed to do that to get this Blue Jay taking flight carrying an acorn. So my Sony 200 to 600 weighs in at about 5 pounds, and the camera is very lightweight, and that means I can hand hold it. Or Canon's new 100 to 500 millimeter lens is even lighter. It's an astonishing 3 pounds. And Nikon's 500 PF is almost as light as that too. But in comparison, my Canon 500 f4 weighed in at 8.5 pounds. And add on to that the heavy DSLR and battery pack and so on. No way could I handhold that. But of course, the gear is just your toolkit. Certainly you need good quality gear and you need to be very familiar with those controls. So be sure to study your user guide to learn what all those buttons and dials on the camera do. But they're also online. There are some much more user-friendly instructional videos that show you how to set up your particular camera model. And in terms of camera settings, by definition, bird behavior is movement, whether that's a singing marsh wren or a bird feeding or flying. So you want to select the optimal settings for moving subjects. And we're going to get some technical stuff over with now. So what I'm talking about here is pick a fast shutter speed. I'm using at least 1,000th of a second, often much faster now, and to stop the subject's movement so your bird's sharply focused and not blurred. And for the record, I always keep the image stabilizer on, even when I am using a fast shutter speed and or on a tripod. I'm shooting in burst mode, meaning high-speed, continuous drive mode, to capture sequences of shots. So don't dismiss this as spray and pray. You still have to be focused on the bird, but then once it does something cool, you fire off a short burst of images, and that will increase your chances of capturing the peak of the action. And finally, understand how to get the best out of your camera's autofocus system. And that, in fact, has a whole suite of settings of its own, but I'm only going to mention a few of them. So first of all, you want to use that AF mode intended for moving subjects. So for Canon, that's AI servo. For Nikon or Sony, it's AFC. And that ensures that the camera is focusing continuously as the subject moves. And then this is really important. Get really familiar on how to select AF points and groups or zones of different sizes and manually move them around the frame. Or in some circumstances, you're going to want to leave it to the camera by using a dynamic focus area setting, which activates all or most of those AF points, like Canon's automatic AF point selection or Sony's wide or zone setting. And they're especially useful for fast, erratic action, especially in birds in flight. And if your camera has tracking AF and or IAF, they can be game changers for photographing moving birds. I don't know how these eye detection algorithms work, but they really do. So in most cameras, modern cameras now, you get a choice of human or animal IAF. Obviously, you'd pick the animal one. But the newest Sony body, the A1, adds in a third option, bird eye autofocus. And apparently it's incredibly good from what I'm hearing. So that's enough technical stuff. because really it's the backstories, as far as I'm concerned, that really tell you how to get the shot. Because behind every great bird behavior image, there's a whole suite of factors that fall under the umbrella of fieldcraft. There's your knowledge about the subject, there's your own physical and mental abilities, your skill at approaching the subject, whether you're cautious and calm. All these factors taken together that let you develop a strategy for being in the right place at the right time. On top of that list, you'll see, is knowledge. So if you take nothing else from this talk, I want you to know that the best way to improve your bird photography is to understand birds and have a deep knowledge about their life history and behavior. And knowledge is important because with knowledge comes predictability. And predictability underlies many a good photo opportunity. Once you know a bird's typical activities and habits, you can anticipate what it's likely to do in the future. So I rely on two different kinds of information. I need to know the behaviors typically done by the species, and I need to know the particular habits of particular individuals. So the species behaviors, these are the ones we all learn about, when we learn about birds, are the characteristic behaviors that all members of the bird species do at some point during their life history. So for instance, courtship displays is a courting great egret with its beautiful nuptial plumes, plus plumage care and feeding methods and so on. And feeding, yes. So here's an American avocet feeding. So avocets, there are avocet species all over the world, different ones, but whether you're in Africa or Australia or North America or Europe, you can be sure that all the avocet species are going to forage by walking through shallow water, swishing their bills from side to side. And that's the kind of information we can obtain from websites and books and so on when we learn about birds. Still more important, though, are the habits and the peculiarities of the very individuals you're hoping to photograph. And these are the things that you learn by observation in the field, like when you're scouting. So you can think of it as getting to know the neighbors. Because like us, individual birds have day-to-day routines. They have favorite perches. They have places they like to feed, places where they come to rest and preen. So when I'm scouting an area, I'm watching for repeated activity patterns, like this white-tailed kite in Southern California that hunts for prey in a particular field every morning. And you just have to show up and wait. Or this family of acorn woodpeckers that repeatedly visit this tree where they've stored thousands of acorns for the winter. It's called their granary tree. And predictable activities like these let you determine when and where to position yourself to capture the action. And then there are your own, there are your own physical abilities to think about. And these are the skills that improve with practice. And if you're already a bird watcher, you probably have some of these skills anyway. So being observant, being able to concentrate and not get distracted while you're closely watching, say, a horned puffin, all the different head positions of a horned puffin. Having patience and persistence, but also having quick reflexes. So you can react immediately and press that shutter release when the bird does something cool, like yawning. So these spines on the upper palate there, that's what allows puffins to carry multiple fish at once. So observing birds closely is a lot of fun and very beneficial. You'll learn a lot and you might see things you've never seen before, and it's going to improve your photography in numerous ways. One of the most important being helping you anticipate activity. Because the more you watch, you'll discover that birds often give behavioral cues that something is going to happen. And probably the best known of these cues are the ones birds give when they're going to take flight. So if you can learn to recognize these body language signals, that gives you a big edge. It lets you anticipate the flight takeoff or whatever the action is, rather than reacting to it after it's already started. And then you might miss that decisive moment. So waterfowl, geese and ducks, like this common merganser, they act agitated, they hold their heads up high, and sometimes they flip their bills to and fro between takeoff, and mergansers will then run across the water to take flight. And spoonbills and herons and their relatives and eagles as well, they crouch and sometimes they poop before springing into the air. Cranes lean forward, craning their necks before they take wing. And you can learn to recognize these pre-activity cues by watching birds closely in the field and reading their body language. So most of these cues are visual, but there's a few of them that involve sound, or actually the lack of sound. In this case, it's a downy woodpecker excavating its nest hole. I couldn't actually see the bird digging while it was digging because it was completely inside the hole. The hole was almost complete, but I could hear it tapping. And every so often that tapping stopped. And that was my cue that shortly the bird would emerge and throw out a beak full of wood chips, what it's doing here. So the trick to catching those wood chips in midair, as soon as I heard that tapping stop, watching intently through the viewfinder at the nest hole and starting shooting as soon as I saw the bird's face. And if you're interested in the technical stuff here, the shutter speed for this was a 12/50th of a second. And I did use some fill flash too, a very subtle use of flash balanced with the natural light, because there's a lot of shadowing over this at that time of day. So let's explore how to photograph specific behaviors. And plumage care is a good place to start since birds spend so much time doing it. Preening and bathing birds are very photogenic. And when I'm photographing a preening bird like this wood duck, I try to release the shutter only when I can see its eye, even if the rest of its face isn't visible, like its bill is partly obscured here. And this colorful water, by the way, comes from reflected autumn foliage around the pond where the bird was. And you might actually recognize this pond or this situation because the pond's in the North Chagrin Reservation, part of the Cleveland Metropark system, when I came to visit in October, 6 to 8 years ago, I think it was now. So that's preening, but bathing birds, well, their movements are so fast that you usually can't critically time releasing that shutter when everything's perfect because you can't see it. It's faster than the eye can see. So what this black oyster catcher was doing was typical of what birds do when they're bathing. They dip their front ends into the water and rapidly shuffle their wings around to spread all the water all over their backs. And for this kind of split-second action, I make sure to set a fast shutter speed, so a 2,000th of a second here. I focus on the bird's face, and then I press the shutter button down and I let her rip. And then I choose my favorite frame. And you might ask how many frames I shoot to get a good one. And in this case, this bird was bathing for about 5 minutes in little bouts of dipping and shuffling, during which I shot about 260 frames in bursts of 8 to 12 shots. And this one's my top favorite because the eye's visible. In many of the other frames, there were often out of focus water drops flying past the eye and obscuring the eye. You don't want that. So after a bird finishes its bath, don't miss the final flourish though, because it will flap its wings or shake like this common loon's doing. You might have to wait a while because birds' body care rituals take time, just like we do, hogging the shower for hours on end. So anyway, it's best to use a tripod or some other means of camera support while you wait. Otherwise, you might miss the shot because your arms are going to get tired, your shoulders and arms if you're hand holding. Sometimes, though, all you have with you is a handheld system, and that was the case for this piping plover flapping. I noticed it bathing, and I anticipated it would do this. So while I waited, I sat down on the beach, and to keep steady, I rested my elbows on my knees to keep the whole rig steady and avoid fatigue. And I think this time I was using a Canon 7D2 with a 300 2.8 lens, very heavy, front heavy lens. One tip about shorebirds and actually light small gulls as well, flapping, shorebirds flapping. Sandpipers and plovers and small gulls are such lightweight, buoyant birds that when they flap their wings, they often pop right up into the air briefly. So to be sure you don't clip those wingtips off, frame the shot loosely. That is, leave space around and especially above the subject, and then you'll get the wings in. And then you can crop to your liking when you process the images later. I think this was about 60% of the frame, so I've cropped this one down a bit. So that's wing flaps. There's also wing stretches. They're subtly different, but they're also very photogenic. And birds often stretch their wings after rousing from a nap. So when this American avocet started moving around after a period of rest, I was ready for it. So another point I want to say here is that birds need to be relaxed with your presence if they're going to act calmly and naturally. So photographing them is a whole lot easier if you go to places where they're used to seeing people. So I go to parks and beaches and wildlife refuges that get a lot of human visitors. This avocet's at one of my favorite places out west. This is Bolsa Chica Ecological Reserve. So a fantastic photography hotspot in the suburbs of Southern California, just south of Long Beach, California. Closer to home, though, the birds aren't nearly so tolerant of being approached, and I often have to use a blind. And that's how I managed to be so close to a belted kingfisher, a notoriously wary species, if you've ever tried to approach one. And she's doing what's arguably the most elegant preening pose. She's preening a single feather. And this was along a creek that drains into Cayuga Lake, near, not far from my home, near Ithaca, New York. And I found the perch during one of my scouting visits. I found the perch where this female regularly came to process her catch. And then I set up a blind on the bank nearby. And that red circle shows you where the perch is, out in the creek beyond. So the trick to using a blind is to be settled in it before the bird arrives and to stay put until after it's left. So in this case, I'd show up before sunrise and get in the blind, get all ready, waiting for the bird to make her first catch. And then I'd stay there several hours each morning. It was a morning shoot only. And usually she'd land on the perch with her prey 2 or 3 times in the course of a morning. Here she's got a crayfish. Now, kingfishers swallow their prey whole. So you'd be correct in thinking that swallowing a whole crayfish would kind of be a scratchy, very painful experience. So she solved that by whacking this poor creature over and over against the log until all its claws and all its legs fell off. And then she swallowed what was left. And I can imagine under this perch, there must be a whole pile of crayfish legs and claws and various bits of fish that she's sent there in dispatching her prey. Have a little drink. So birds in the act of feeding can make very exciting action images. This is a cedar waxwing tossing a berry into the air before swallowing it. And other fruit-eating birds, such as bluebirds and robins and thrushes, they do this too. So I'd seen waxwings do this before. I knew it was going to happen. I could anticipate it happening. So I focused on the bird's face and waited to press the shutter button. The instant it flipped its bill up. By the way, that bright halo behind is an out of focus highlight. It's light coming through the distant trees in the background. And you might be interested in the composition here. When I first got focused on this bird, that highlight was off to the left and it was very distracting. So I nudged my tripod over just a few inches with my foot very carefully so as not to scare the bird off, so that it was directly behind the bird. And in situations where the food source is concentrated, it can be more productive to wait near the food for the birds to show up rather than wandering around trying to find them. So that waxwing shot, for instance, was from a local arboretum where I know I can pretty much always find them on the crabapple trees in the fall and winter. So I just go and hang out by the trees. For this black oyster catcher in California, I hung out near a mussel bed where I'd previously seen them foraging for shellfish. So the food source could be a school of fish that comes into a certain place regularly, or for terns or gannets, or flowering fruit trees for orioles in spring, or mast-laden trees for turkeys and jays in fall. And it was this follow the food strategy that was the one single thing that let me capture pinion jay feeding behavior for a book that I was working on back in 2010. And the book's topic was the birds of Mono Lake in Eastern Sierra of California. So these jays specialize on pine nuts, which they gather and store in large numbers as a winter food supply. But I faced a dilemma because I couldn't find the jays at first. I knew they were out there somewhere in the pinyon juniper woodlands, but they're nomadic and they roam around in big flocks in the autumn and winter, searching for food. And I spent weeks combing these trees and combing the area, getting only an occasional glimpse of a flock of pinyon jays and never able to get close to them. Until by chance I found the mother lode of pine nuts. It was a pinyon pine covered with ripe cones. So I waited there for hours every day for 3 days in a row. And it worked. Several times a flock of jays did arrive and they started gathering the nuts. And suddenly there was so much action, I didn't know where to point my lens first. There were dozens of jays flying to and fro, taking off all over the place unpredictably. So this image to me epitomizes the pinyon jay's story. Notice that bill and throat. It's packed them full of as many nuts as it can, and it's flying off to follow its flock mates to a communal caching area, a storage area in the flock's home range, and then it's going to stash those nuts for later in the winter. And this is a very challenging shot to get, technically and physically. So for this kind of non-stop erratic action, it can really help to set the autofocus area to automatic AF point selection or some other dynamic area. And that activates the sensor's entire array of AF points. And then the camera really helps you because it focuses on what it determines to be your main subject. And my camera back then, remember this is 10 years ago or more, was a Canon 1D Mark III. And I thought you might be amused to see how lucky I was to get this bird in focus. So here's a screenshot of what this autofocus area looked like from a Canon 1D3 with the original image in it. The red rectangles indicate that this entire array of 45 points in those days is active, not very many autofocus points. And obviously that selectable array in this older camera didn't even cover, more than half or less of the sensor. Unlike in many of today's cameras, we can have hundreds of points and almost the full sensor is covered by them. Anyway, my strategy here in terms of focus, I would have pre-focused on the bird while it was still on that pine cone on the left there. And then when it took flight, by incredible luck, part of it fell within that sensor array. There's nothing wrong with luck. Today with my Sony A9, I'd probably use tracking AF with the zone or wide setting. So photographing these elusive jays took a lot of time and effort, but fortunately there are places where birds are much more easy to find. Down in Florida, white pelicans chasing a school of fish at Florida's Merritt Island wildlife refuge. And they've attracted all these gulls and egrets and terns, looking to grab any of the hapless fish that are trying to get away from the pelicans. Anyone who's been to Florida, I think there might be even some people from Florida in the audience tonight. If so, hello. Anyway, so anyone who's been to Florida knows that the birds there can be ridiculously tame. There's a tricolored heron. Now, herons, you probably know this, usually use this slow stalk and stab method to catch their prey, but sometimes they hunt much more actively. So this tricolored one's strategy was to half run and half fly over the water surface and then stab its bill down into the water if it saw fish. And then it would circle around over the pond and do the same thing again and again. So we were talking about predictable activity patterns, repeated activity patterns earlier on. Perfect photo opportunity. So I could see it coming, so it was easy enough to focus on it at a distance and then fire a burst of shots as it went by. And the shutter speed here would have been 2500th of a second to stop the motion of the bird and capture those water splashes. So I want to make a very quick natural history diversion here, because this is a very energy intensive foraging method. So why do it? Well, it seems to be a location specific behavior. Biologists have observed this strategy more often in places with a high density of alligators, making it dangerous for that heron to go along the edge of the pond stalking along, because that's where the alligators are hiding. And in fact, there were many alligators in this pond. It's part of Vieira wetlands, and Jim and I were talking about Vieira wetlands earlier, a fantastic photography hotspot south of Titusville, Florida. Just watch out for the alligators. So where there's food, there are going to be food fights. Birds simply have no table manners and they don't like to share. So this is also at Vieira wetlands, fighting great blue herons. And the one on the right has caught a giant salamander called a greater siren. And as soon as it saw this prize, another heron immediately charged over and tried to steal it. Of course, avian conflict can arise for many reasons. Territoriality, for instance. And whenever birds nest in close proximity to each other, like at seabird colonies or heron rookeries, there's going to be conflict. This is black skimmers bickering over nest sites. And it's the famous skimmer and tern colony on Nickerson Beach at New York's Long Island, where I was last August. So typically when I travel somewhere for photography, I stay multiple days in one location. It's a good idea to do that, because that lets you have a good idea of what's going on in different parts of the colony. And then you can try different subjects. And once I start shooting, I'm often paying attention to multiple things at once. So here originally I had my lens trained on a skimmer nest with a chick that's a little bit closer to me than this shot. But in my peripheral vision, I was also paying attention to these two pairs that were sorting themselves out nearby. And I managed to get on it, focused on it, the action, thanks to my Sony's tracking autofocus. Excuse me. So here's something we can probably all relate to, being given the cold shoulder when you just want to be part of the group. There's a male wood duck, third from the left, trying to join some females that were snoozing on a floating log. And just like us, though, birds like their personal space. So as he approached, I anticipated that this might happen. And indeed, they told him to buzz off. So I would say 99% of my action shots rely on autofocus, but very occasionally I use manual focus. And this is a good example, these black-capped chickadees that were bickering over a sunflower head in my yard. Now, winter chickadees in flocks, they spend the winter in flocks, and those flocks always have a strong dominance hierarchy. I'd noticed that if two of these little birds arrived at the sunflower or a feeder at the same time, they'd often fly up and fight briefly in midair. So to set the scene here, I shot this from a photo blind in the snow. This is my backyard, using a 500mm lens on a tripod. And one important thing to keep it in mind here is I could predict exactly where that action was going to occur, right over the center of that sunflower. But there was a downside because I needed to leave a lot of space above just in case the birds flew into it. I was concerned that it would be really impossible to autofocus on once it started. So I turned off autofocus and I manually pre-focused on the middle of that sunflower, and then I framed loosely. Then, this is very important, instead of looking through the viewfinder to see them coming, I watched over the top of the camera through the mesh window of the blind. And whenever I saw two chickadees approaching at the same time, I fired off a burst of images without even waiting for them to start arguing. Well, certainly I deleted a lot of duds in which no argument happened, or they were outside the plane of focus, but the reward is this one, and you only need one cool one. So after winter conflict, now it's moving into spring, and it's time for courtship. And there are few avian activities as dramatic and photogenic as those to do with courtship and nesting. We've all seen courting wild turkey toms, I bet. And they're actually rather satisfying to photograph because the displays are slow, and these guys are going to display for as long as there are females nearby. So you've got plenty of time to compose the frame and think about how you want it to look. But there are other courtship behaviors that birds do that are much more fleeting. And the bizarre displays of courting ducks, for instance, are a good example. They last just a split second, and they're very challenging to capture. So clockwise from the top left here, we've got a green-winged teal doing a head up, tail up display. To his right, there's a hooded merganser doing a head throw. Below him, there's a redhead also doing what's called a head throw. And finally, in the lower left, there's ruddy ducks courting, and they're doing the "we're so cute" display. But even the old overlooked mallard that we all ignore, that's got some groovy courtship moves too. And I bet many casual observers have never noticed them, or if they did, probably not understood what was going on. But what's nice about this time of year is they're doing it now. So you can try to photograph them displaying right now. Ducks actually start courting in the fall, and they display all the way through the winter and then into spring. So it's worthwhile checking out your local duck pond or a lake. So what you look for is a group of mallards excitedly milling around, and listen for the whistled calls they do during these displays. And then watch closely, because each display lasts only a second or two. And here's a little bit of video. So watch these three in the middle here. Hear the calls. Fast, aren't they? Well, if you manage to catch it, sometimes you can get very bizarre pictures like this. This is a mallard doing the head up, tail up display. Now, to photograph these displays is challenging. They're so brief. And I've had my best success in the past by picking one male that's just displayed and then keeping focused on him as he swims around until he does it again. He's likely to do it again. And some cues to help you. Sometimes the males hesitate briefly before displaying. Also, you might have seen in the video, they sometimes do subtle head shakes before they display. But you're definitely going to need fast reflexes. And you're going to have to go out west to see this courtship display. This is Western grebes, and Clark's grebes do this too. And they perform a dramatic display where the pair run across the water in synchrony, producing this splashing wake. And it's called rushing. Takes just a few seconds, and once it starts, it can be difficult to focus on and frame those running birds. But that's easier when you can anticipate the display by recognizing the behavioral cues that precede it. And this is what you look for. You look for two grebes swimming toward each other with heads held low and giving these loud, raspy calls. And that's your cue to focus on one of them and start firing a burst of shots. Immediately they rise out of the water and begin running. Use a fast shutter speed to keep that splashing water sharp. This is a 1600th of a second. But, some of our most familiar backyard birds have endearing courtship behaviors too. So northern cardinals, looks like they're kissing, but actually the male is feeding his mate in preparation for breeding. And they'll do this for weeks, starting around now, actually. So if you have bird feeders in the backyard, watch for them doing this. And a tip here that if you miss the shot the first time, they usually do it several times in a row. So keep focused on the female, and the male will likely hop over to her and feed her again. And you can take a little cue from the female. You might see her fluttering her wings, which is her way of begging. And that's a good thing to pay attention to. But even much maligned rock pigeons, they can be pretty photogenic too when they get all lovey-dovey. You can watch for them preening one another as they gear up to nest. Capturing birds interacting in this way is a powerful way to evoke emotion with your images, because those interactions so often remind us of our own behavior and our own lives. Nowhere is that more true than showing baby birds with their parents. And it's the so-called precocial birds, young birds, that appeal to us the most. Those are the cute, fluffy ones that can run or swim around as soon as they hatch. So we're talking goslings and ducklings and the chicks of shorebirds, terns and grebes and cranes, and especially cranes. This is some cranes in Florida, actually near Orlando, actually, yeah. And when those little ones, the little baby cranes are called colts, when they're newly hatched, you can really play up the size difference between the parents and the young. Even better is to show some nurturing behaviors, such as parent birds feeding their young. Common tern family here, and it's another image from New York's Long Island a couple of years ago. And when there are multiple birds in the shot, especially if they're close to you like this, you can keep them all in focus by closing the lens aperture down to increase the depth of field. So close your aperture down a stop or two, and then that will avoid having some of the birds look soft. So for this one, I think I'm using f8 with a 500mm f4 lens. Birds brooding their young are very photogenic too, because despite that downy covering, precocial young birds do need frequent brooding for warmth. They don't quite thermoregulate as well as they should. And in swimming birds, like this western grebe, the young climb onto the parent's back and snuggle into the plumage. And in fact, this grebe has actually got 3 chicks there, but 2 of them are snuggled in so tightly that you can't see them. And here's kind of brooding overkill. This is a mother common merganser who's got at least 12 ducklings. They're pretty much well grown at this point, but I can't actually imagine how she was ever able to brood them all at once. And I've seen common mergansers with as many as 17 ducklings. And when shorebirds brood their young, it looks like they've sprouted extra legs. So there are already 3 chicks snuggled under this piping plover, and a 4th one wants to get under there too. So photographing plover adults together with their chicks can be really frustratingly difficult. They run really fast, and it's not worth chasing them. It's not ethical to chase them. It's stressful for the birds. And in fact, it would be illegal to chase them for an endangered species like a piping plover. So, but however, shorebirds, once they start brooding, they may stay put for a while. So if you can get to see them brooding, you could get down low and move very slowly, and you might be able to crawl toward them as I did here. And this was 2015. I don't think I could crawl on the beach anymore, because doing a belly crawl is not getting any easier as I get older. And in fact, I prefer to let the birds come to me rather than pursue them, by keeping low and still and concealing myself if necessary. And that's what I did at Lake Bowdoin National Wildlife Refuge in Montana to photograph eared grebes with their young. Here I'm taking a break after lying on the lake, waiting for the grebes to come within camera range. And by keeping still for long stretches of time, you become part of the scenery. And it actually can be surprising how close birds will come to you. So there's a phalarope walking by, I don't know, a couple of feet from in front of my lens. I'm using a wide angle lens here. So what you're doing is you're gaining the bird's trust, and then you'll be rewarded with natural behavior, such as an eared grebe feeding the chicks riding on its back. So there were a number of grebe families out on the lake. Sometimes I saw 8 or 10 families out there within one binocular view. But when I first found them, they stayed way out of camera range. But sometimes I noticed they would come in closer to shore. And I discovered while I watched them, that they were foraging for damselflies in these mats of green algae, this green slimy looking stuff that were floating just offshore, pushed there by the wind. So for 3 mornings in a row, I lay down near on the lake shore there, near water level, and I waited for the grebes to come closer. And to make it comfortable, I had a foam pad I was lying on. I had a camouflage jacket pulled over me. And I've got my gear supported on a low angle contraption called a skimmer ground pod. You may have heard of this thing. It's like an upside down pie plate that you attach your tripod head to. And then if you're working on a beach or a mud flat that's very flat, you can move the skimmer around easily by pushing it ahead of you. And it allows you to shoot from a low angle, and you get these lovely, compelling eye level views of birds with softly out of focus foregrounds and backgrounds. But boy, is this hard on the neck. Surely there's got to be an easier way than this. There is another way. We've switched to New York now for briefly to get this low angle viewpoint. And you can do it if your camera has a tilting rear monitor like this one does. You pull that out and angle it up toward you. Then you can sit on the ground instead of lying and look down at the monitor instead of craning your neck upward to look through the viewfinder. If you're using a DSLR these days, it will have to be in live view mode to do this. I think people probably remember, maybe you've even got one, the right angle viewfinders we used to be able to find. They're not really available for very many camera models anymore. So this is a good way around that. But be aware that working this way really does take some getting used to, especially if the bird's moving around. Like, it's hard to even find the bird sometimes. So you might find that critical compositions are a whole lot more difficult to achieve this way, but it's worth a try. So final take home point about the eared grebes, we're back to Montana again. So this opportunity came about due to a particular combination of conditions. In this case, it was wind and weather and wind direction. So don't always assume that you can come back and repeat something, because what happened here was after 3 mornings of good shooting, the weather changed big time. And on that 3rd day, a cold front came through. It was a huge storm. I was caught in the rain and the hail. The wind changed direction, and it blew all those mats of algae out into the middle of the lake. And that was that. So the grebes never came close again. So when you have a good opportunity, don't hesitate and strike while the iron is hot. So when you're working at locations with good all-round visibility, such as we're here, it's fairly easy to keep track of what your subjects are doing. But in more closed-in surroundings, like the marshy pond where these barn swallows were, you may not actually be able to see the adult approaching to feed its young, and that makes capturing the decisive moment a challenge. Barn swallows feed their fledglings on the wing, and they just fly in, feed, and leave. It's often just a split second. But you can take a cue from the youngsters, because hungry young birds can always see their parents arriving. They're always watching around. So the best strategy is to focus on the youngster's face and wait for it to start begging. And that's signaling you that the adult's arriving. And then at that point, you can press that shutter button down and get the shot. And again, be sure to stop down the aperture to increase your depth of field and ensure all those birds are in focus. So I'm using F8 here. So capturing woodland species, though, woodpeckers and songbirds and their fledglings, that's a whole lot more challenging, because once a downy woodpecker youngster leaves the nest, it and its parents can be next to impossible to follow as they move around through the woods. They're going to be out high, there's going to be branches in the way, and so on. But this is where, if you feed birds all year round, backyard bird photography can bring you a great advantage. So then the local birds may bring their fledglings right to you. And that's what happened here. I attached a nice shapely branch to my bird feeder, and I'm sitting in a blind in the backyard nearby, and the baby downy's on the left, and I'm focusing on it while the adult goes back and forth to the feeder to get some food for it. After the breeding season, many bird species gather into flocks to migrate and spend the winter. These are migrating tree swallows on the beach at Cape May, New Jersey, a big migration hotspot in September. Now, when you're shooting single birds, usually you're recommended, you want to get down to the bird's eye level and then take advantage of your telephoto lens's shallow depth of field to isolate the bird from the surroundings, from the background. But for a flock of birds resting on a beach, or for instance, a raft of waterfowl sitting on the water, it's actually better to look down on them from a higher vantage point, and then the flock will fill the entire frame. So here I'm trying to be at a higher vantage point, but when you're 5 foot nothing, that's kind of hard. I'm standing on tiptoes, stretched up as high as I can, and looking down on the flock and using f11 with a short telephoto. So I did a bit better here because I was able to get up high on a bluff, on a road, on a bluff overlooking this lake where this raft of redheads was coming in. And this is Cayuga Lake in New York's Finger Lakes region, again, near where I live. And there are tens of thousands of these ducks overwintering here every year. So I'm using a 500mm lens, no converter, and I've stopped down the lens aperture to f20 to increase the depth of field, to try and get all those ducks from front to back in focus. And I like the sinuous shape of this flock here. And flocks can really take on a spirit of their own when they move as one. They change shape and move as one through the landscape. And compositions that include birds in the landscape can be very compelling. And a short zoom lens is really great here, a really versatile lens here. In this case, it was a 70-200. And these are Wilson's phalaropes on migration in late summer at Mono Lake in California. And I noticed them approaching from my right. I quickly zoomed the lens back to 100mm that let me frame these iconic rocky towers and their reflection. Stopped down the lens aperture in a flash, f14, and then waited for the flock to fly into the frame. And the fact that they made this beautiful arc was total luck. I had no idea they were going to do it. So birds flying and capturing birds in flight is probably what every photographer aspires to. Because of all avian activities, it's flight that best embodies their spirit. But it's also the most challenging genre of bird photography. You need to follow and you need to focus on and follow an already moving bird, like a juvenile peregrine falcon. And that's technically and physically demanding. And your success is going to depend on several factors. First of all, those camera settings for bird behavior that I mentioned earlier, they're going to be even more important for birds in flight. So quick technical reminder here, we're talking about a fast shutter speed. How fast is going to depend on the size of the bird and how fast it's flying. So for instance, a peregrine might be 1,000th of a second, but a flying hummingbird in natural light is going to use maybe a 3200th of a second or faster. Use the image stabilizer, shoot in burst mode, and get the best out of the autofocus system. But successful flight shots also depend on having a workable situation. So one where there's predictable behavior patterns, especially flight paths, and then optimal wind and light direction too. They can always have an influence, and we'll look at all of these. So photographing a bird in flight is a two-step process. You've got to get focused on it, number one, and number two, you've got to stay focused on it as it flies along. And acquiring that initial focus is the first challenge. And that's particularly hard for you and the camera if the bird's already close and it's already filling a large part of the frame. Instead, focus on the bird while it's still some distance away and relatively small in the frame. And that's what I did for this northern harrier hunting over the fields. So I place the autofocus, the central autofocus point or area over the bird's face or neck, and then press the shutter release halfway, acquire focus. And then as the bird flies along, keep that AF point on it. And once you consider the bird close enough, then you can fully press the shutter release to make the shot. And with long telephoto lenses, one challenge can be simply finding the bird in the camera's viewfinder in the first place. Practice is going to help you, but there are a couple of tricks to use. The first one is to use the method that people use to teach beginning birders how to use binoculars. And that's you sight the bird by eye first, not through the viewfinder. You keep your eye on the bird, and then you raise the viewfinder up to your face without looking down. Another thing that helps that initial focus, and one thing that I do a lot, is to pre-focus on a stationary object at about the same distance away as the bird is. So for instance, for these black-bellied whistling ducks, I first focused on a tree on the shore of the pond where it looked like they were going to land. And that gets you in about the right focal range to locate the bird a bit more easily in the viewfinder. And then once you've acquired focus, stay focused by panning with the bird as it approaches. And I'm sure you all know this, but panning means you swing the lens around at the same speed as the bird, trying to keep that autofocus point over its face or head, and then shooting bursts when it's in a nice position. And it's a whole lot easier to do if you're hand holding. Those newer cameras too are going to do a much better job of tracking the bird. So I'd love to go back here and try my A9's tracking autofocus on these pigeon guillemots where my friend and I are photographing them. This is Santa Cruz in California, and they're coming in, the birds are coming in to their nest sites on the cliff below where my friend and I are standing here. Predictable flight paths. So panning is a skill that's going to improve with practice. There's really no magic trick. The more you practice, the better you get. So you could start with large, slow-flying birds like Canada geese or gulls. If you go to Florida, you've got pelicans, cranes, and egrets, and so on. And it helps to go to a place where you've got lots of opportunities, constant opportunities, like a seabird nesting colony. This is the big northern gannet rookery at Cape St. Mary's in Newfoundland, where I was about 3 or 4 years ago. And here's where flight paths become important, because colonial seabirds often use consistent routes to and from their colony. And it's by noticing those flight paths that can help you decide where to position yourself for the best opportunities. And this particular morning, most of the gannets were flying in from my right. And this one's carrying nest material. So I sat down on a rock where I had a good view of them coming, and then I was able to get on them as they approached and flew past me. But be aware that these flight paths are going to change from day to day, depending on the wind direction. Because wind is another important factor in flight photography. My throat's getting dry. Windy conditions. Because while windy conditions can ruin your chances for a nice portrait of a perched bird, for flight shots, a windy day can actually help you. Battling a headwind slows down the flight of birds, making it easier to focus on them and track them. So these Arctic terns, I photographed these from a car in Iceland on an afternoon that was so windy that the entire car was shaking. Furthermore, I didn't have my beanbag with me that I usually put over the open window ledge of the car to support the lens. So I'd borrowed a pillow from my hotel, but I also had to raise the window glass up a bit because I couldn't get my camera to the right level. So that meant everything was very, very unsteady. But because these terns were flying so slowly against this strong wind, with all these conditions stacked against me, I managed to get on them and get some sharp shots of them framed nicely. So coastlines, especially with high cliffs, are typically very windy places, and they can be fantastic for flight shots. This is an Atlantic puffin colony on the coast of Iceland, where I was with some friends a few years ago. What happens is at places like this, the wind hits the cliff and the wind is deflected upwards. And that strong updraft holds the incoming birds aloft. So they seem to hang in the air in front of you. It's fantastic. So birds, especially large ones, tend to take off and fly and land facing into the wind. So for a flying bird to be facing you, you want to position yourself so the wind's at your back. Then there's the issue of lighting. Here it's overcast, so the light's even and non-directional. And so the wind direction and the light direction don't have to be in agreement. But if it's a sunny, windy day, they do. So for the bird to be nicely illuminated, as well as facing the camera, you want the wind to be blowing from the same direction as the sun's shining, as it is for this osprey. So on a sunny morning, you want an east wind. For a sunny afternoon, you want a west wind. And usually you want to avoid the opposite conditions with the sun against the wind. Although if that happens to be the occurrence, you can actually turn that to your advantage and be creative. So still keep the wind at your back, but shoot toward the sun for some lovely backlighting. This is snow geese coming in to land at Bosque del Apache in New Mexico. Another really good place to go if you're a bird photographer and you want to practice your flight shots. Fantastic place. So it's an exciting time to be a photographer. We've got fast moving advances in digital technology. We've got mirrorless cameras coming along with ever better autofocus. And that's all changing the way we take photos, making it easier for all of us, letting us push the boundaries. And I love the freedom it's given me now to experiment and be creative without thinking I'm wasting film all the time. And it's given me the confidence to take photographic risks with fast moving subjects and split-second action, unique occurrences, because that avian spirit is fleeting and elusive. And something happens sometimes, like the sumac leaves here briefly obscuring a flying blue jay, producing this artistic looking blur of color. And when that happens, don't think, shoot. You may never get a chance again, and you may get something special, something quite artistic and abstract. And if not, well, there's always the delete key. So bird photography is a huge topic, and I've pretty much only scraped the surface tonight. But if I've piqued your interest, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion and tell you about a book, my book, Mastering Bird Photography, that covers everything you've learned tonight and much more too. And it's available anywhere, but if you want to buy it, if you kindly purchase it from my publisher, Rocky Nook, and then you can use the code or coupon code MREAD40, and you could get a 40% discount off the cover price. And so with that, I'll thank you all for being here and being so patient, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, go back to reality. Whoa.
Thank you very much, Mari. That was fantastic. So I would, if anyone has any questions, I would ask you to type them into the chat, and I'll take a look at the chat. And as things come up, if there are questions, I can relay them to Mari and get an answer for you. So, but
maybe nobody's got any questions. Oh, what's your typical aperture? Okay.
Yeah.
So what, can you repeat that to me, David? Because I can't see.
Yes, what is your typical aperture for photos? I know you said something about going to f8.
Yeah, so to be quite honest, for most of my work, I'm shooting as wide open as I can be, which for the lenses I'm using right now anyway, is f5.6 or 6.3. Even when I was using a Canon 500 f4, I'd so often have a converter on it that my actually wide open aperture was f5.6. So I'm typically at 5.6 for a single bird. But if you've got multiple birds in the frame, or you're very close to a bird and you want to get a big depth of field, then yeah, sure, by all means, close it down. Certainly for flocks, I use f8 or f11 for multiple birds in a frame. Yeah, definitely. And of course, we can get away with that these days because we've got these amazing cameras where you can notch up the ISO and not have it be too bad, and then possibly process it afterwards in some of the amazing noise reduction software we've got.
Do you have any recommendations for best places for loons?
Oh, well, if you really want the very best places for loons, you should go on a wildlife photography tour. And there are two groups that do them right now on different sides of the country. One is Chaz Glatzer's Shoot the Light tours, and he works with loons in Michigan. The other people, I think, it's Greg Downing and possibly Anna Murphy, and they're out in British Columbia. They take their tours to British Columbia. What these guys have got is habituated loons, and they're often approaching them on boats. The birds are very used to seeing people and not being harassed and so on. So if you really want to be productive and get some amazing pictures, it's well worth the money to go to those. Otherwise, not really, because you'd have to pretty much find your loons yourself on a lake somewhere and get them used to your presence. That's the challenging thing, is getting them habituated to you being there and not stressing them.
I've found in Maine that I'm surprised sometimes how calm the loons will be and how natural they'll be if you're in a single kayak and just being slow, but
right.
When you're on the water, it's like you're a big Canada goose or something.
Exactly.
You don't seem to be as bothered.
Yeah. But I don't have any places I know where you could do that. I mean, you've found your own personal ones, and that's the best way to do it, really.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation and sharing your gorgeous work.
Well, thank you.
You've spent so many hours watching birds. I'm curious if you have a favorite species or a couple, if it's too difficult to choose just one.
So I have an answer for that, because what I'm really interested in bird behavior. And so if my perfect bird would be a bird that's got a complex social life, that's really colorful and interesting and is active and beautiful, and that would be acorn woodpecker. I mean, they're incredibly interesting birds. They live in big social groups, in families. They have complex interactions within the families. It's like Peyton Place, going on in the acorn woodpecker society. Then they've got this fascinating storage of acorn behavior. So we have these granary trees where they stuff all these acorns in. So there's always loads of activity. And of course, they're cute looking. They're funny, they're colorful. They've got these little cute clown faces. So I'd say acorn woodpecker.
Is that a Western species?
That's a Western species, yeah. So let's see. Yeah, pretty far west, actually, I think. So Eastern California, Arizona, I think you can find them. And then northward from that, yeah.
We end up driving across Interstate 90, across New York State, fairly frequently. And we always go through the Montezuma Refuge there, which seems to be filling in with cattails and things from what you can see from the interstate. Is that a productive place?
It's very patchy productive. It's over the years, I've been going there for years and years and years, and it's changed a lot over the years. Some years it's been amazing, other years it's just not been good at all. And a lot of it depends on the status of the vegetation along the wildlife drive, because that's where you're going to get most of your opportunities, and that's a morning shoot only. As it is now, you really can't see into the channels unless you have something like, one of those jacked up trucks where you're looking down on stuff. If you've got a regular car, you can't see past the cattails. So it can be very frustrating. But I've actually got some good shots in there, depending on which year it was. Yep.
Are there any other questions? Let's see. I'm not seeing any. I would just then thank you so much for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you. I'm
Just
glad you all enjoyed it and hope you got something out of it.
well, I know I can speak for a lot of folks, and there's a lot of thank yous coming along here.
Oh,
but,
look good. Thank you very much. It's
yeah,
really been a pleasure to be here, and I wish I could see you all in person, or maybe one day.
well, we'll have you back.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we'll say goodbye.
Well, thank you very much, and
Thanks.
stay healthy and
I will. Okay.
enjoy your prairie chickens.
Oh,
Or
yeah.
was it?
Thank you. Yep. And good to see you again, Jim, and we'll meet up one of these days.
You're on mute, Jim. There.
Anyway, thank you, Maria. It was a wonderful presentation, as always. I was not the least bit surprised how good it was, and love your work. Always have.
Thank you very much.
Mutual admiration. Big fan.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Okay. Bye, everybody.
All
Nice
right.
to see you
Good
all.
night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.